Blessings and peace, beloved. Thank you for joining us once again for our Great Controversy devotional series, where we are using the book Christ Triumphant that goes through the themes that are realized and experienced in this great controversy between Christ and Satan. And the devotional thought for today, February the 1st, is entitled God Begins Anew with Seth. And the scripture reading, and there are a few scriptures, are taken from Genesis chapter 4 verse 25 onwards to Genesis chapter 5 and verse 3. And in the paraphrasing it says, God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Adam begat a son in his own likeness after his image, and called his name Seth. To Adam was given another son, to be the inheritor of the divine promise, the heir of the spiritual birthright. The name Seth given to this son signified appointed or compensation. For, said the mother, God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Seth was of more noble stature than Cain or Abel, and resembled Adam more closely than did his other sons. He was a worthy character, following in the steps of Abel. Yet he inherited no more natural goodness than Cain. So Seth was not born with a greater moral advantage than Cain. So Seth and Cain had the same moral standing or footing to stand upon. Cain made a choice to disobey God and to disregard God's requirements. Seth did not make that choice. Seth made a choice to follow God and to regard his requirements. And so Cain's destiny was based upon his choice, and he chose to disregard the express command or the express will of God. Seth, on the other hand, his destiny was also different because he chose to obey the express command of God. So what we see between both individuals is how they chose to utilize their volitional capacity to choose. One chose God, to regard God, and one chose to disregard God. And so if we want to know what our destinies will be, it will be based upon the choices that we make, because our choices determine our destiny. And that was a devotional thought for a few weeks ago. Our choices determine our destiny. And so Seth was not made better or more holier or noble than Cain, but Seth chose God. My prayer is that we also would choose God. Yet he inherited no more natural goodness than Cain. Concerning the creation of Adam, it is said, in the likeness of God made he him. But Adam, after the fall, begat a son in his own likeness, after his image. The Sabbath was honored by all the children of Adam that remained loyal to God. But Cain and his descendants did not respect the day upon which God had rested. They chose their own time for labor and for rest, regardless of Jehovah's express command. And so you see that Cain is being consistent with his choices. So it is Cain's consistent choices, it is Cain's habits, it is Cain's desires that he has enforced or reinforced by his choices and his habits that gave Cain a destiny that would lead or led to the lake of fire. And so Cain and his descendants, and by virtue of his habits that he reinforced with his continual choices to disregard God's express command, Cain now has influencing influenced his posterity to also disregard God, and therefore his children became known as idolaters. His children became known as those who chose their own way above the way that God has laid out for them. So Cain once again continually tries to give God his own personal service instead of the service that God requires of him. Therefore, Cain now is not serving God. He is serving his own selfish wills, his own selfish wishes, his own selfish desires. Cain is not serving God. They chose their own time for labor and rest, regardless of Jehovah's express command. And this was Cain's problem from the gates of Eden. He brought the offering that he wanted to bring. He did not give God the offering that God expected of him. And this is why Christ says in his parable, how many of you, being good, being fathers to your children, if your son asks you for bread, you would give him a stone? That's wickedness. So a good parent would not give their child a stone when they ask for bread, but here Cain is giving God a stone when God asks him for bread. Here Cain is being inherently wicked. He's choosing and preferring his own path, his own wisdom above God's wisdom. This, by God's grace, is something that we as the children of God must be very careful not to do, to render to God our own service instead of his service. Remember, we are not marking out a path for our feet. The path of righteousness has already been marked out for us by the blood-stained feet of Prince Emmanuel, who died on the cross of Calvary for us. So all we are doing is walking in the footsteps of Jesus. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. Cain tried to reinvent the wheel. For some time, the two classes remained separate. The race of Cain, spreading from the place of their first settlement, dispersed over the plains and valleys where the children of Seth had dwelt, and the latter, in order to escape from their contaminating influence, withdrew to the mountains and there made their home. But in the lapse of time, this is now the children of Seth, who dwelt in the mountains while the children of Cain dwelt in the valleys. But in the lapse of time, they ventured little by little to mingle with the inhabitants of the valleys. And so both the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain lived lives that were diametrically opposed to each other in principle. One was following the express commands of God, and the other was disregarding the express commands of God and only following their own will, their own intellect, their own feelings, their own desires. They had no regard for what God willed, for what God required, and for what God expected of them. They lived lives, selfish lives, unto their own selves, and they remained separate. Seth dwelling in the mountains and Cain dwelling in the valleys. This association was productive of the worst results. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that there were fear. The children of Seth, attracted by the beauty of the daughters of Cain's descendants, displeased the Lord by intermarrying with them. So the children of Seth were beguiled by the beauty of the daughters of Cain. And through this attractive means, remember, from the Garden of Eden, God made eating of the tree. The devil made eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil attractive. God did not make it attractive. God said that in the day that ye eat thereof, you shall surely die. So God stated the fact. This is what happens when you eat from this tree, in order to get Adam and Eve to choose death. because sin is death. It leads to death in order to get Adam and Eve to choose death. Satan, Lucifer, speaking through the serpent, had to make sin look attractive. Sin had to appear appealing. He had to allure them. He had to enchant them with sin so that sin that leads to death would become desirable. The devil likes to make death look desirable. And so this is why when people commit suicide, is because suicide, dying, seems more desirable than living, and therefore they choose death. And so here the inhabitants, the children, the descendants rather, of Seth, they are now choosing death because the descendants of Cain, the daughters of Cain, were made to look attractive. And this is the package that the sin came in. And they, just like Adam and Eve, took of that fruit of the daughters of men and ate. And now this was to the detriment of their eternal destiny. The children of Seth, attracted by the beauty of the daughters of Cain's descendants, displeased the Lord by intermarrying with them. So when the devil wants to tempt you, he's going to send that beautiful woman. He's going to send that handsome man. He's going to send that beautiful thing. He's going to send that shiny object. He's going to send that pleasurable and pleasing experience. He's going to send that fashionable association to allure you, to enchant you, to trap you. Many of the worshippers of God were beguiled into sin by the allurements that were now constantly before them, and they lost their peculiar holy character. So how did they lose their peculiar holy character? By intermingling with the heathen, by intermingling with people that they knew were decidedly on the side of the wrong, by people that they knew did not have no intention, no motive of serving God, who were well satisfied to serve themselves. So they could not change the descendants of Cain's minds. These people were decidedly on the side of the wrong, and this is how they lost their holy character. And so through our associations and the influence of associations upon us, and we're beginning now to pattern our lives or to receive the influence of others who are not living for God or living for eternity, through the association and the influence of short-sighted people and blind people, we can lose our peculiar holy character. For nearly 1,000 years, Adam lived, and notice, these allurements, as we backtrack just a little, many of the worshippers of God were beguiled into sin by the allurements that were now constantly before them, and they lost a peculiar holy character. So the allurements weren't there, the temptation weren't there, so they placed themselves in the way of temptation, whereas before they were not in the way of temptation. But every day the temptation is pressed home again unto their soul, and now the temptation becomes more and more attractive, more and more pleasing, more and more pleasurable, and less offensive in the eyes of a holy God. This is how they would have interpreted it, because they're seeing it every day, and now they're becoming polarized in their mind, in their thinking, and now they're choosing to do what they're seeing other people do, how they're seeing other people live. For nearly 1,000 years, Adam lived among his descendants a witness to the results of sin. Faithfully, he sought to stem the tide of evil. He witnessed the widespreading corruption that was finally to cause the destruction of the world by a flood. And though the sentence of death pronounced upon him by his Maker had first appeared terrible, yet after beholding for nearly 1,000 years the results of sin, he felt that it was merciful in God to bring to an end a life of suffering and sorrow. So Adam at first as we have just read, thought that the sentence of death was extreme because he did not yet see the results of sin. He did not see the community, the society, the world that sin would create. He did not yet see the experience that sin would create that only leads to death. Now when he understood it, and he understood the reason for the flood, when he understood the results that are going to come about as a result of sin, Adam recognized that this is actually an act of mercy. This is an act of mercy. Beloved, God does not want us to live in misery, in sin, or with the shadow of death hanging over us. Obedience to God is what he requires, because we lost Eden, we lost eternal life by disobedience. We will only regain it through Jesus Christ by obedience. Have an overcomer's day today, because an overcomer is an obedient servant to God. Blessings and peace.